White here. In this segment about chainsaws, I want to talk about fuels. Now, in another segment, I was talking about how you want to maintain the right mixture in your. You want to come up with the right mixture for your chainsaw. Well, in doing that, the issue of your fuel storage comes in. Okay, two-stroke gas. I try to write on my gas can for the chainsaws, the two-cycle engine things I have, trimmers and such, to make sure that I'm using the mix can. And you don't want to loan your cans to anybody else, because you're the one that knows the mixture. You don't know if anybody's putting other fuels in it, or maybe they put in gas only and no oil, whatever. But you don't want to loan out your stuff without knowing that stuff. Every once in a while, okay, after a while your fuel can may get looking like this, and it covers up your marking of what the mix was. Or if you marked it, and you just know by what it looks like that it's a two-cycle can. Hopefully you don't forget. But when you start getting multiple cans, well, is that mixed or is it not? Well, then you start looking to see if it has the dye in the fuel, if it's blue fuel or red fuel or whatever the dye happens to be for that particular fuel. So another issue comes up with contaminated fuels. Some years ago, when I had my little Poland saw, and that little cheap Poland saw cut a lot of wood. I mean, I used it for all kinds of things. Many cords of wood and cutting down trees. It was just a little saw, and I just worked that thing like crazy. Well, I was mixing up some fuel one time. I was out of gas. So at that time, I had some gasoline in I didn't have any cans when I filled up, and I was at the gas station in town, and so I just grabbed an empty one that said diesel on it. Okay, so I put since I only had a 2-gallon, I was going to transfer it when I got back home. I transfer it to my mix can. So anyway, so I grabbed a diesel can, and I very carefully at the pump I put in 2 gallons of gas. Okay. What I had failed to do was to make sure that diesel can was empty. As it turned out, I found later I'll tell you the event, there was some residual diesel fuel in the bottom of the can. Well, when I put the gasoline in it, my mix and everything, I stirred it all up, and it was all good to go, mixture-wise. And then when I got home, I poured it into my mix can, which happened to be looking like this. I poured it in here, and then I had mixture ready to go with that Poland saw, right? Okay, so I transferred it from this diesel fuel tank can, and I put it in my little mix can, and I got my little Poland saw, and I put it in there, and I was cutting away, and I was doing it's a pretty heavy cutting, because I was cutting a lot of brush down there along the creek and getting some firewood, and cutting away, and I had this big log that I was cutting limbs off, and boy, this thing is cutting really great. This little engine is just screaming. It was just screaming, and I was cutting away and screaming. I mean, I didn't even stop. I didn't even let off the throttle, and I'm just cutting away, and finally I let off the throttle, and that thing kept screaming. That little saw, without my hand on the trigger, kept screaming. So I shut off the switch on it, and that thing would not shut off. It was still screaming full speed. Well, now what do I do? Maybe a switch failed or something, but that saw would not shut off. So what do I do? Well, I got to shut this thing off. So I went to the big log, and I buried, as fast as I could, I buried that saw into that log, and that wasn't big enough, and it sawed on through, and so I went over to the next section, a real big segment of the log. Okay, and I buried that sucker in that log and finally stalled it out and it stopped. What in the world happened here? Then I got to thinking, well, wait a minute here. I'd used that diesel can and put gasoline in it, and I had what apparently had diesel fuel mixed in with the gas. And what my little engine was doing is it was dieseling. Well, diesel engines don't require ignition. They depend on their compression to fire. And the way you shut off a diesel engine is you shut off the fuel. Well, in my little saw, I couldn't shut off the fuel. You know, it doesn't have a fuel shut off. So that little engine was screaming with diesel fuel contamination, and it was dieseling, and there was no way to shut it off. And so after I was kind of concerned about it. I took it apart. I took it back to the shop, and I took it apart and examined it, and that thing was clean as a whistle. Beautiful, inside and out, no carbon. I mean, it was really slick and everything. The spark plug, took it out, and it was, I mean, it had a little bit of carbon on it from when it was running under gas, but it was spotless. I mean, it was beautiful. But why wouldn't it, why did it continue to run? Well, the diesel contamination is what happened. And that happened not only, I discovered this, not only with my chainsaw, but when I was over in Iraq, the guys were using it was a gasoline-powered electric generator, just a little 1,500 watt unit that they were using to power up some equipment. And one of the Iraqi guys was supposed to refuel it. Well, he had grabbed the wrong fuel from this other jar, because they had over there, they had Yanmar diesel engines that looked like they were small engines that they used on some of their their generators, and they are small diesel engines. Okay, well, he just grabbed the wrong can and he filled it up this gasoline thing, and he fired it up, and that thing was running and smoking like crazy. I mean, it was smoking like crazy, but it was running and running and running. And what's going on here? Go shut that thing off. So, see why it's smoking. Anyway, couldn't get that thing to shut off. Turned off the ignition. That sucker would not shut off. And it didn't have a bar to bury in and install it like the chainsaw. So how do we stop this thing? It's in Runaway. It's at acting like it's at full throttle, and no way to stop it. So finally I got the bright idea, well, we'll just take off the shroud as best we could. We get the shroud or the air cleaner in the shroud area so I could get to the air intake. And so we got to the air intake, and I stuffed rags into the air intake and just choked it. And I had to pack those rags in tight in order to starve out that air so that it could not burn and ignite by any air. Well, that's the crazy thing about diesel fuel. It doesn't require an air mixture to fire. Well, it does, but you have to starve off a lot of air to get it to completely quit. But I finally got them packed in there tight enough to where it's choked out that engine and got it stopped. But that was another example of what will happen. And maybe soon I'll get an old chainsaw and we'll put some fuel in and we'll see what happens when it diesels. And let's just see what it looks like. But anyway, contaminated fuel is a big issue. Keep your fuel clean. Keep it the fuel that you know what it is that goes into your saw. Because some of your saws and some of your two-cycle equipment is pretty expensive stuff. And especially you don't want to be damaging it. If you can't shut it off, it becomes dangerous. And so anyway, keep your fuel clean. Keep known fuel at source. You use the best fuel that you can afford. Don't use the cheap fuel. Don't use the cheap oils. Don't use the cheap stuff, because that cheap stuff will cause your equipment to crap out. And then what do? You just put a $500 or $600 saw into the junkyard. You don't want to do that. So anyway, keep your fuel clean. Keep everything properly mixed and identified so you know what it is. And that'll save you a lot of grief. So that's it for now.